The glass ceiling is shattered!
Get down! Everyone, get down! This is beautiful.
Thank you for saving my life.
The shadow hasn't just joined the light, it has redefined it.
Nicholas didn't flinch when the enforcer's heavy hand slammed her against the cold brick of the alleyway. She didn't gasp when the muzzle of a silver pistol pressed into the soft skin beneath her jaw. She had spent months memorizing the rhythm of Hong Chanpeng's life, but seeing him under the flickering streetlights of the district was different. He wasn't just the sharp-suited businessman the city feared. He was a predator who had finally cornered his shadow. She knew the moment was over when Chan Peng stepped forward, his sharp undercut reflecting the moonlight and the ink on his neck pulse-quickening. The air turned heavy, not with the scent of rain, but with the suffocating weight of his authority. But it wasn't until he leaned in, his gaze locking onto her intense, dark eyes, that the reality of her situation shattered. He didn't order her execution. Instead, he reached out and adjusted the lapel of her black blazer with a terrifyingly slow, deliberate motion. It wasn't a gesture of mercy. It was a mark of ownership. He wasn't going to kill her. He was going to use her. As he whispered the terms of her survival into her ear, Nicholas realized she hadn't just approached a mafia boss. She had been lured into a cage. She hadn't been caught. She had been claimed for a war that was only just beginning. The silence of the district was never truly silent. It was a low, industrial hum that Nicholas Schinner had learned to breathe in rhythm with. For 90 days, she had been a ghost in the machinery of Hong Chanpeng's life. It had begun in the humid air of a late summer evening when she first saw his motorcade roll through the narrow streets like a funeral procession for someone not yet dead. To anyone else, he was a titan of industry with a sharp undercut and a penchant for expensive Navy suits. To Nicholas, he was the man who held the key to a debt written in blood, a debt her family back in Kampala had been paying for a decade. She had turned stalking into a frantic, beautiful science. She knew that he took his tea at precisely 6:15 a.m., black and bitter, while staring out at the rising sun from a balcony that overlooked a city he effectively owned. She knew the exact weight of the silent enforcer who stood behind him, a man whose shadow was long enough to swallow a girl whole. She had filled notebooks with the patterns of his security, identifying the 3-second blind spot in his camera loop and the specific gait of his lead driver. Her obsession wasn't born of love, but of a desperate, calculated necessity. She was a woman who had lost everything to the shadows, so she had become one. But tonight, the shadows were no longer enough. The information she had gathered, the grainy photos of his trusted lieutenants meeting with the rival Kim syndicate in the back of a damp shipping container, was a ticking bomb. If she stayed a ghost, the bomb would go off and take her with it. As Chan Peng stepped out of his obsidian-black sedan, the rain began to fall in thin, needle-like shards. Nicholas stepped out from behind a rusted fire escape, her black blazer dampening, her gold hoop earrings catching the strobe-like flash of a distant neon sign. The enforcer moved instantly, a wall of muscle closing the distance, but Chan Peng raised a single, gloved hand. The world stopped. "You've been watching me from the shadows for 90 days, he said, his voice a low, melodic threat that vibrated in her chest. "Do you want to see how a dead man looks up close? Or do you want to tell me why you haven't pulled the trigger?" Nicholas didn't flinch as the barrel of a pistol found the hollow of her throat. Instead, she reached into her pocket with a slow, deliberate grace, pulling out a single photograph. It was the moment she broke her 3-month silence, her voice steady despite the cold steel against her skin. "I'm not here to kill you, Mr. Hong. I'm here to show you that the people you trust are already doing that for me." In that moment, as he looked from the photo to her resolute, intense gaze, the air shifted. The hunt was over, but a far more dangerous game had just begun. The transition from the rain-slicked alley to the heart of the Hong Empire was a blur of tinted glass and clinical silence. Nicholas sat in the back of the obsidian sedan, flanked by the enforcer whose presence felt like a physical weight pressing against her ribs. She didn't look at the gun still resting on the seat between them. Instead, she watched the neon veins of the city pulse against the window, her reflection, resolute and veiled in black, staring back at her. She wasn't a guest, and she wasn't a prisoner. She was a variable that Hong Chan-peng hadn't yet solved. The headquarters was a fortress of glass and steel tucked away in the city's upper district, a place where the air smelled of ozone and expensive cologne. When the doors hissed open, the enforcer didn't lead her. He shoved her. He was a mountain of a man, his black suit straining against shoulders built for breaking bones. He steered her toward a sub-level interrogation suite, a room designed to strip a human being of their dignity before the first question was even asked. "Sit," the enforcer growled, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle the metal chair bolted to the floor. Nicholas complied, her movements fluid and devoid of the tremors he clearly expected. For the next hour, the enforcer practiced the art of psychological erosion. He paced the perimeter of the room like a caged beast, his shadow flickering across the stark white walls. He leaned in close, his breath hot against her ear, detailing the various ways a stalker could disappear in a city with so many deep construction foundations. He slammed his fist onto the table, the crack echoing like a gunshot, and loomed over her, trying to force her to blink, to flinch, to beg. But Nicholas Schinner was a woman forged in the fires of a 3-month obsession. She had studied the monsters until she knew the length of their claws. She kept her spine straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and her gaze, intense, dark, and unwavering, locked onto his. Every time he tried to break her spirit with a snarl or a threat, he found himself drowning in the absolute stillness of her eyes. She wasn't looking at a killer. She was analyzing a target. The door at the back of the room opened with a soft, authoritative click. Hong Chan-peng stepped in, his navy suit jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the intricate black ink that coiled around his forearms like serpents. He signaled for the enforcer to step back. The big man hesitated, frustrated by the girl who wouldn't break, before retreating into the shadows. Chan-peng walked to the table and looked down at the girl who had haunted his periphery for 90 days. He saw no fear in her, only a cold, calculated readiness. "He's killed men twice your size for looking at him the way you are now," Chan-peng noted, his voice devoid of heat. "Then he wastes his time on ego," Nicholas replied, her voice a calm blade in the quiet room. "I'm not looking at him. I'm looking at the man who is about to lose his empire because he's too distracted by the girl in the chair." A slow, dangerous smile pulled at the corner of Chan-peng's mouth. The lion's den was no longer a cage. It was an interview. The air in the interrogation suite grew thin, the silence heavy with the scent of Chan-peng's expensive tobacco and the metallic tang of the enforcer's suppressed rage. Chan-peng didn't sit. He leaned against the heavy metal table, looming over Nicholas with a grace that was entirely predatory. He studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes tracing the line of her braids and the defiant set of her shoulders. He wasn't looking for a confession anymore. He was looking for a reason to keep her alive. "You speak of empires and distractions as if you've already won a seat at the table," Chan-peng said, his voice dropping to a silk-wrapped blade. "But you are still just a girl who broke into a lion's den with nothing but a camera and a grudge. My enforcer believes you should be silenced. He believes that shadows who get too close to the light should be snuffed out." In the background, the enforcer shifted, his knuckles cracking, a sound like dry wood snapping in a forest. He was the wall, the final stop for anyone who crossed the Hong family. He stood as a silent, monolithic promise of what happened to those who outlived their usefulness. Chan-peng leaned in closer, his tattooed neck inches from Nicholas's face. "However, I find myself curious. You've seen things my own security missed. You found the rod in my inner circle while they were busy guarding the front gate." He slid the photograph she had provided across the table, tapping the face of the traitorous lieutenant. "This is a start, but a single photo isn't enough to buy your life. I have a mole, Someone high enough to know my routes. Someone close enough to poison my tea. My enforcer wants to break you. I want to use you. He straightened up, his expression becoming a mask of cold stone. The deal is simple, Nicholas. You have 48 hours. You will stay within these walls, and you will use that obsessive little mind of yours to identify the rat. If you succeed, you become my shadow, protected, paid, and powerful. If you fail, or if I find out you're playing both sides, I turn my back and let the wall finish his job. Nicholas looked past Chan Peng, meeting the enforcer's hollow, murderous stare. The stakes weren't just about her survival anymore. They were about the justice she had been chasing for 3 months. She didn't look at the gun, and she didn't look at the exit. She looked directly at the man who had just claimed her future. I don't need 48 hours to find a rat, Nicholas whispered, her voice steady and sharp. I just need you to stay out of my way while I catch it. Chan Peng's lips quirked into that same dangerous, appreciative smile. Then the clock is ticking, little shadow. Don't make me regret my mercy. The transformation began not with a choice, but with a command. Within the high-tech confines of the headquarters' upper residential wing, Nicholas found herself surrounded by a team that moved with the same surgical precision as Chan Peng's enforcers. They didn't treat her like a guest. They treated her like a weapon being polished for its first strike. Her worn street clothes and the comfortable layers she had used to blend into the city's shadows were stripped away, replaced by fabrics that felt like liquid armor. She sat motionless as her micro-braids were meticulously gathered and styled into a sleek, severe crown that exposed the sharp line of her jaw. A black headscarf, a veil of fine, dark silk, was draped over the back of her head, not to hide her, but to frame her intensity. The final touch was the jewelry, large gold hoops that caught the clinical light of the room, adding a glint of defiance to her focused gaze. When she stepped into the formal black blazer, the structured shoulders felt like a mantle of authority. She was no longer the girl in the shadows. She was the silhouette that would haunt the light. When the doors to Chan Peng's private study hissed open, he didn't look up from his monitors immediately. He let the silence stretch, a tactic designed to make others fidget. But Nicholas stood like a statue, her hands clasped behind her back, her presence filling the room with a new, sophisticated gravity. The enforcer stood in the corner, his wall-like frame casting a long shadow, his eyes narrowing as he struggled to recognize the prey he had slammed against a brick wall only hours prior. Chan Peng finally turned his chair. His gaze traveled from her polished boots to the gold that shimmered at her ears, finally locking onto her dark, unwavering eyes. A flicker of something, recognition, perhaps, or a predatory approval, crossed his face. The ghost has finally taken shape, he murmured, his voice echoing in the quiet room. He reached into his desk and slid a sleek, encrypted tablet across the mahogany surface toward her. From this moment, you are not a stalker. You are my lead consultant on internal security. To my associates, you are the eyes they never see coming. To my enemies, you are the last thing they will ever see. Nicholas took the device, her fingers steady. The weight of the gold hoops felt heavy, a constant reminder of the price of her new identity. Consultant is just a title, Mr. Hong, she said, her voice dropping into that sharp, resolute tone that had first intrigued him. I prefer the term you used before. I am your shadow, and shadows see everything. Chan Peng stood, the tattoos on his neck visible as he adjusted his blue-textured tie. Then start looking, Nicholas. We leave for the gala in 3 hours. The mole will be there, and I expect a name before the final toast. The 3-hour window before the gala became a rare, fragile pocket of stillness. Chan Peng stood before a floor-to-ceiling mirror, his movements methodical as he unbuttoned his navy suit jacket. He didn't ask Nicholas to leave. Instead, he beckoned her closer as he loosened his tie. As the silk fabric fell away, the ink on his neck seemed to come alive, trailing down beneath his collar in a complex tapestry of black and gray. Nicholas watched with her characteristic, intense gaze as he rolled his sleeves past his elbows. The tattoos weren't the decorative markings of a modern rebel. They were the scars of a survivor. On his left forearm, an anchor was wrapped in barbed wire, the symbol of his first decade spent on the docks of Busan, fighting for every scrap of territory he now commanded. On the right, a predatory bird with its wings spanned across his shoulder blades represented the flight from a poverty that had claimed the rest of his family. Every line is a lesson paid for in blood, Chanpeng said, his voice reflecting off the glass. He traced a jagged line of ink that ran through a faint, real scar on his wrist. In my world, everyone wants something they haven't earned. They want the power without the ink. They want the throne without the climb. He turned to face her, his sharp undercut casting a shadow across his brow. Most people who look at me see a monster or a paycheck. They flinch when I move. They lie because they think it will save them. But you. He stepped into her personal space, the scent of expensive tobacco and cold rain clinging to him. You stared into my gun and told me what I ate for breakfast. You didn't blink when the wall tried to crush your spirit. You are resolute, Nicholas. You have the eyes of someone who has already seen the worst the world has to offer and decided not to look away. Nicholas felt the weight of his stare, a physical pressure that rivaled the enforcer's strength. She thought of the long nights in Kampala, the debt that had shadowed her upbringing, and the meticulous notes she had taken while watching him. I didn't have the luxury of looking away, Mr. Hong, she whispered. Where I come from, if you close your eyes, you lose what little you have left. Chanpeng reached out, his thumb brushing the gold hoop at her ear. It was a gesture of profound respect disguised as intimacy. That is why you are still breathing. I don't need a sycophant or a terrified girl. I need someone whose soul is as etched with purpose as my skin is with this ink. He pulled back, his mask of cold authority sliding back into place as he reached for his formal textured tie. Keep that resolve. Tonight, the people in that room will try to peel it off you. Don't let them. The gala had been a battlefield of forced smiles and lethal subtext, but the drive back through the neon-drenched arteries of the city felt like a descent into a different kind of danger. Inside the darkened cabin of the sedan, the city lights flickered across Hong Chanpeng's face in rhythmic pulses of sapphire and crimson. He had remained silent since they left the ballroom, his gaze fixed on the skyline, but his presence was a heavy, magnetic pull that Nicholas found impossible to ignore. The enforcer sat up front, a silent shadow behind the partition, leaving the two of them in a pocket of pressurized intimacy. Nicholas leaned her head back against the leather, the gold hoops at her ears catching the passing glow of a street lamp. The adrenaline of the evening was beginning to ebb, leaving behind a raw, electric awareness of the man sitting mere inches away. You handled the ambassador's questions with more grace than my seasoned lieutenants, Chanpeng said, his voice breaking the silence like a low chord of a cello. He didn't turn to look at her, but his hand moved, his fingers brushing the fabric of his navy trousers near where her own hand rested. I've spent 90 days learning how you speak, Mr. Hong. It wasn't difficult to mimic the rhythm, Nicholas replied. Her voice was steady, but her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of formal black silk. Chanpeng finally turned his head. The professional mask, the one that dictated the movements of empires and the deaths of men, slipped just enough to reveal the man beneath the ink. His eyes were no longer cold or calculating. They were searching. You spent 90 days watching me, Nicholas. But tonight, for the first time, I felt like you were actually seeing me. He reached out, his hand hovering for a fraction of a second before his fingers grazed the edge of her black veil. He didn't pull it away. He simply traced the line of the silk down to her shoulder. The touch was light, almost tentative, a stark contrast to the man who had ordered executions with a flick of his wrist. Nicholas didn't pull away. The defiance that usually defined her gaze softened into something more vulnerable, more dangerous. I saw a man who is tired of being the only predator in the room, she whispered. The air in the car thickened, the space between them shrinking until she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Chan Peng leaned in, his shadow swallowing her light. For a breathless moment, the Mafia boss and the Stalker ceased to exist. There was only the hum of the tires on the asphalt and the sudden, undeniable gravity of two broken people recognizing their own reflection in the other. He didn't kiss her, but the way his gaze lingered on her lips was a claim more profound than any contract. In the quiet of the soul night, the hunt had officially turned into a haunting. The stillness following their shared moment in the car was shattered the second they crossed the threshold of the penthouse. The air felt different, thicker, charged with a static that made the hair on the back of Nicholas's neck stand up. She didn't need her notebooks or her 90 days of surveillance to know that the rhythm of the house had changed. The security detail was too quiet, and the wall, the enforcer who usually stood as a silent sentry, was missing from his post at the primary elevator. Chan Peng, Nicholas whispered, her voice a sharp warning. She used his name for the first time, the professional barrier dissolving under the weight of an imminent threat. Before he could respond, the heavy mahogany doors of the study swung open. The enforcer stepped out, but he wasn't alone. Behind him stood two men Nicholas recognized from the grainy photos she had taken in the shipping yard, the Kim Syndicate's primary cleansers. The enforcer's suit was rumpled, and his jaw was set in a way that suggested he had finally traded his loyalty for a more lucrative master. "You were right about the rot, Mr. Hong," the enforcer growled, his massive frame blocking the only exit. "But you were wrong about who was holding the knife. You brought a ghost into your house, and in doing so, you stopped looking at the man who has been carrying your secrets for a decade." Chan Peng didn't flinch. He didn't even reach for the weapon concealed beneath his navy blazer. He simply stood there, his tattooed neck pulsing with a slow, rhythmic calm that was more terrifying than any outburst. "I expected better from a wall," he said softly. The enforcer leveled a silenced pistol at Chan Peng's chest. "The Kim Syndicate offers a pension. You only offer a grave." He turned his cold, murderous gaze toward Nicholas. "Step aside, little shadow. Go back to your alleys and your cameras. This isn't your war." Nicholas felt the cold weight of her old life calling to her, the safety of being a ghost, the anonymity of the girl who just watched from afar. She could leave. She could vanish into the soul night and let the monsters finish each other off. But as she looked at Chan Peng, she didn't see a target or a paycheck. She saw the man who had looked at her scars and her resolute nature and given them a name. She didn't step aside. Instead, she moved with the fluid, calculated speed she had practiced in the shadows of Kampala. Her gold hoops flashed in the clinical light as she reached into the hidden holster beneath her formal blazer, a weapon Chan Peng had taught her to draw just hours before. "I'm done watching," Nicholas said, her voice a lethal promise. She stepped directly into the line of fire, shielding the man she had once stalked with her own body. "If you want to get to the king, you have to go through the shadow." The summit was held in a cathedral of concrete and glass, a neutral ground where the city's most dangerous men gathered to decide the fate of the Han Empire. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and unspoken death threats. Chan Peng sat at the head of the polished obsidian table, his navy suit impeccably sharp, his tattooed neck a defiant map of his journey to the top. At his right hand stood Nicholas, her silhouette draped in formal black silk, her gold hoops glinting like coins on a dead man's eyes. The atmosphere was a coiled spring. The betrayal of the enforcer had left a vacuum of power in the rival heads. Men with silver hair and hearts of flint smelled blood. They looked at Nicholas not as a consultant, but as a curiosity, a temporary distraction before Chan Peng's inevitable fall. "You brought a shadow to a den of lions, Chan Peng." The eldest patriarch sneered, his voice like grinding stones. "Perhaps you've grown as old and soft as the woman you've chosen to hide behind." Chan Peng didn't blink. I don't hide behind her. I stand with her. There is a difference. The movement happened in a fraction of a heartbeat. From the gallery above, a glint of light caught the barrel of a sniper's rifle, a final, desperate gambit by the Kim Syndicate. The room erupted into a deafening roar as the glass ceiling shattered. The other Mafia heads dove for the floor, their masks of dignity discarded in the dirt. But Nicholas didn't dive. She had spent 90 days calculating every angle of Changpeng's world, and she knew the trajectory of the threat before the trigger was fully squeezed. With a cry that was less a scream and more a declaration, she lunged across the table. She didn't push him down. She threw herself into the path of the lead. The impact was a dull, sickening thud that sent a shockwave through her shoulder. The formal black blazer, once so crisp and authoritative, bloomed with a sudden, wet crimson. She collapsed against Changpeng's chest, her intense gaze flickering but never leaving his eyes. The room went deathly silent. Changpeng caught her, his hands, usually so steady and cold, trembling as they pressed against the wound. He looked up at the gathered heads, and for the first time in 30 years, the monsters in the room saw something that terrified them. A man who no longer cared about his empire, only about the blood on his hands. She took the bullet meant for the king, Changpeng whispered, his voice a low, lethal vibration that promised a massacre. Nicholas gripped his lapel, her fingers staining the navy wool. Through the haze of pain, a ghost of a smile touched her lips. She hadn't just saved his life, she had ended the debate. Her loyalty wasn't just proven, it was written in blood. The Stalker had become the sacrifice, and in doing so, she had become the most powerful person in the room. The sterile white of the hospital wing was eventually replaced by the familiar, dark luxury of the penthouse, but the woman who returned to Changpeng's side was no longer the one who had left it. The bullet had left a scar on Nicholas's shoulder, a jagged map of her loyalty that she wore with more pride than any piece of jewelry. During her recovery, the city had held its breath. The news of this stalker, who had bled for the king, had rippled through the underworld, turning a scandalous rumor into a legend of ironclad devotion. Nicholas stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the study, the morning sun catching the gold hoops at her ears. She wore a tailored black blazer that draped perfectly over her bandages, her gaze as intense and focused as the day she had first stepped out of the shadows. She wasn't watching the street anymore. She was watching the horizon of an empire she now helped command. Behind her, the heavy click of the door signaled Changpeng's arrival. He didn't approach with the cold authority of a boss, but with the quiet reverence of a man who had looked into the abyss and found his soul mirrored in another. He stopped behind her, his hand resting tentatively on her uninjured shoulder. The ink on his neck seemed less like a warning and more like a history they now shared. "The council is waiting," Changpeng murmured, his voice a low vibration against the silk of her veil. "They no longer ask why I kept you. They only ask if you have deemed them worthy of an audience." Nicholas turned, her dark eyes locking onto his. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. She was no longer his consultant or his acquisition. She was the sovereign of his inner circle, the only person in a world of monsters who had proven she could hold his heart without breaking it. "Let them wait a moment longer," she replied, her voice steady and sharp. "I want them to understand that the shadow hasn't just joined the light. It has redefined it." Changpeng reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. The world outside would continue to whisper about the age gap, the cultural divide, and the bizarre beginning of their union. They would call it a tragedy, a scandal, or a stroke of madness. But as Nicholas leaned into his touch, she knew the truth. She had started as a ghost seeking justice, and she had ended as a queen who had found a home. In the heart of Seoul, between the blood and the ink, two broken paths had converged into a single, formidable road. The hunt was over. The reign had begun. From Uganda to Korea, from the shadows to the throne, Nicholas Schinner was no longer a stalker. She was the only thing Hong Chan Peng truly feared to lose, and the only thing that made him invincible.